When I woke up on Easter Monday and heard the news that Pope Francis had died, I felt unexpectedly sad. I'm not even Catholic, but I was sad, perhaps selfishly, because he had not done what I so hoped he would do, to tell the world what I knew he knew. I wrote him a couple of letters. I sent him a couple of books. Probably none of it reached him. But I was so convinced, based on what I knew about him, that Pope Francis was the one chosen to reveal to the world what he knew, what all popes have known about Jesus and Mary Magdalene, the truth about Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Now, I didn't expect to get an envelope from Rome, and I didn't realize until I heard of his burial plans that he answered. Maybe not me, but the call, the knowledge that he was the one. He knew. Because when I learned where he'd chosen to be buried, not beneath St. Peter's Basilica, which was the traditional burial place, but in the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, I was amazed. In 2015, I visited that basilica. I went twice. In fact, I was so fascinated by what is in there. I photographed an image of a cardinal that is backed or framed by a pyramid, an obvious connection to Egypt. I even put that image in one of my books. I was shocked that the iconography in that basilica so clearly and openly celebrated the goddess. And now looking back, it seems that possibly the basilica was designed to tell the secrets when the time was right. And Pope Francis is laid to rest there now. And he's going to be our guide because he knew. This is taken from that book that I put the image of the cardinal in. And let me read it. I said at that time in 2017, perhaps Cardinal Agostino Favoriti surrounded himself in enigmas to reveal to the world that he knew, just as Pope Gregory XVI knew, that the truth about Jesus and Mary Magdalene remains hidden from the people. If this Pope and Cardinal knew, so too do today's cardinals and popes. And in our opinion, if ever the Pope had the integrity to come clean, it's Pope Francis. The evidence that we've uncovered and have shared in several books has been available since the time of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. All the popes have known. Pope Francis had access to it. And no doubt there's more evidence that has not been made available to the public, at least not until now. But maybe this is the time. Pope Francis took a big leap when he exposed the importance of the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore. For over a decade, Pope Francis made quiet pilgrimages to the Basilica Santa Maria Maggiore. He would go there to pray before he left. He'd go there when he returned safely home. So, what was it that drew Pope Francis to this ancient basilica, so powerful that he chose it as its final resting place? Or did he choose it as a final resting place to send a message? The word Maggiore links the Basilica Santa Maria Maggiore and the Porta Maggiore, Rome's East Gate, which just happens to be a mirror replica of Jerusalem's East Gate, which suggests that Rome is the quote unquote New Jerusalem in the book of Revelation, and the place where the high priests of the Nazarenes moved when the Jerusalem temple was destroyed in 70. Tradition dates the baker's tomb to the final years before Christ, but English archaeologist named John Henry Parker thought otherwise. And he made his judgment based on its design, the decorations, and where it's placed. And he argued it belonged not to the time of Caesar, but to the first century after Christ. And it wasn't hidden, it was meant to be seen because it was positioned where two major roads met. It was placed there to greet or confront everyone entering Rome from the east. It's a silent monument with a message waiting to be decoded. Pope Francis would have known, but some modern scholars also agree with Parker that the baker's tomb wasn't built before Jesus, that it dates actually to the middle of the first century, most likely during the reign of Emperor Claudius, which places its construction squarely after the time of Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Beneath the Porta Maggiore and the baker's tomb lies a forgotten temple where mathematics met mysticism and geometry whispered the soul's ascent. It was discovered by accident in 1917. It sits 40 feet below the modern streets of Rome, and it dates to the early first century, the same time as Jesus and Mary Magdalene. Its builders were the Neo-Pythagoreans, seekers of harmony, truth, and spiritual awakening. Those who believed that number, shape, and proportion were the language of the divine. And Pope Francis knew what Clement of Alexandria once declared, that Philo, the Jew of Alexandria, was also known as the Pythagorean, and that Philo promoted a method of biblical interpretation that challenged Paul's claims. The title of the Pythagorean wasn't poetic, it was philosophical. Philo's writings bridge Hebrew scripture and Greek mystery. And on the walls of the temple beneath the baker's tomb are the same blend of Greek and Roman myths carved in stone. You see centaurs and sea gods and Medusa. It's a world where logic, symbol, and spirit entwined, a world Philo understood, and one that Pope Francis did not forget. Pope Francis knew that between 420 and 423 of the Common Era, Emperor Honorius buried both the tomb and the gate beneath a massive fortress wall, a huge structure that would erase the sacred symbolism. For nearly 1400 years, the Porta Maggiore and the Baker's tomb lay hidden from view. What you see on the left here is their original form, close to the original form. There's some damage, obvious. That's how they were seen before they were entombed in stone. And on the right is an 18th century engraving that shows them sealed away, swallowed by the fortress Honorius built, except for one end of the tomb. It wasn't until 1838 under Pope Gregory XVI that they were uncovered and restored. The question is, why were they buried in the first place? And also, why did Gregory uncover them? The burial of the gate and tomb occurred at the very same time there was a major campaign to suppress pagan and other so-called heretical cults, including and especially Neo-Pythagorean and feminine-centered traditions. This concealment coincided with the construction or the enlargement of the Santa Maria Maggiore Basilica. Pope Francis surely knew that a tomb that honored a freedman baker and his wife posed no threat to the newly proclaimed official church of the Roman Empire. The reason the gate and the tomb were buried was a secret the official church in the 5th century wanted to hide from the world. For how long? Did some know that progress and education would one day reveal the secrets that they so desperately tried to hide? Did Pope Francis know that the tomb, the gate, and the underground temple weren't just architecture, they were symbols? To the Neo Pythagoreans, they represented the journey of the soul, the sacred ascent toward unity. But to the rising Church of Rome, they were a threat cloaked in geometry and aligned with the wisdom the Church could not control. So they buried it, not to preserve it, but to erase it. Because this wasn't just a burial, it was a warning. This truth must be hidden. There's a feature of biblical Hebrew that most people are unaware of, but Pope Francis would have known about this. Biblical Hebrew is written in consonants only. There are no spaces. There are no vowels. There's no punctuation, just strings of consonants. And the example here, BTLHM, that can be rendered Bethlehem, little town. Equally correct is Betula M, Virgin Mother, or Bethlehem, House of Bread, and that Elohim, daughter of Goddess Mother. All are correct. The context determines the choice. One of the most important string of consonants is LHM. It can be correctly rendered Lahem and translated bread. It can be rendered Elohim and correctly translated gods because the im suffix creates a plural. LHM can also be correctly rendered Elohim and translated goddess mother. Now, the house of Shammai and the house of Hillel used different vowel spaces and punctuation to produce their different words in different sentences from the same string of consonants, and the result was two Torahs. One for power gained through intimidation, and one for the teaching of compassion. Pope Francis would have known that for a brief window in history, from about 40 BCE to 66 of the Common Era, Jerusalem upheld a rather fragile peace between the two visions of the Torah. The House of Shammai was founded by the strict legalist called Shammai, and the House of Hillel was founded by the compassionate sage known as Nasi Hillel. Together, they honored an alliance, an agreement that respected difference, valued dialogue, and protected their coexistence. But beneath the surface, their doctrines competed, and those differences, well, they were embedded in the names, the pseudonyms the two men were given. The Hebrew word shama is translated here and obey. So the priest of the house of Shammai taught Yahweh's 10 commandments. Obey the commandments or face the consequences. That was their underlying philosophy. And they taught the superiority of men, and they awaited the return of the prophesied Messiah from Micah 5, 2, and 3. The underlying philosophy and teaching of the House of Hillel is explained in Hillel's maxim: that which is hateful to you, do not do to your fellow. That is the whole Torah. Now, it was paraphrased and is in the Christian Bible as do unto others as you would have them do unto you. But it originated with Hillel. The House of Hillel taught the duality principle of creation, allegorized as God, goddess. And they awaited the prophesied return of daughter Jerusalem, the great mother of glory, Micah 4:8. So we're going to look at the two names. Hillel is first. That's from the Hebrew consonants HLLL. But equally valid vowels and spaces can also create Hala El Ella, which is translated praise God, goddess. And Hillel's grandson, Gamaliel, GMLL, can be rendered Gamma El Ella and translated God Goddess Within. So this family of Hillel used names to identify the doctrine that they were teaching and the version of the Torah that was being used in the house of Hillel. That Torah was the basis for the Hebrew mark that was later plagiarized and turned into a Greek gospel according to Mark. But the Mark 4:10 through 12 says, when he was alone, those who were around him along with the 12 asked him about the enigmas. And he said to them, to you has been given the secret of the kingdom of Elohim. But for those outside, everything comes in enigmas, in order that they may indeed look but not perceive, and may indeed listen but not understand. So the secret of the kingdom of LHM was that LHM is Elohim, goddess the mother. Now this secrecy may have been due to the fear or the danger posed by the group that believed women were inferior and were violently opposed to any teaching that tried to infer that women were equal to men. And that's exactly what the House of Hillel was teaching. Pope Francis knew that the ancient historian Josephus recorded Jerusalem's high priests in the 60s included two men with the same name, Yazus. One was high priest in 62, he was the son of Damnaeus, and the other was the son of Gamaliel, who was high priest in 64 and 65. Now, these weren't just religious figures, they were descendants of Hillel himself. They were keepers of the tradition that honored the god goddess. But in 66, everything changed. A war erupted, zealots stormed the temple and forcibly removed Gamaliel and his sons, Yazus bar Gamaliel and Yazus bar Damnaeus, carrying the legacy of compassion and balance from the heart of Judaism. It was the end of the Nazarene priesthood, the beginning of something entirely different. Yazus was the title of Nazarene high priests, and they ceased to exist, replaced by a godman called Yazus from Nazareth. Well, Francis knew that the destruction of the temple in 70 wasn't just a Roman conquest. It was a shift in sacred authority. Matthew and the zealots were driven out. The temple was destroyed not by chaos, but by order, an order led by Neo-Pythagoreans, Titus, the son of Emperor Vespasian, and Tiberius Julius Alexander, son of the powerful Alabarch of Alexandria. What about the title Alabarch? In Hebrew, it's LBRK and can also be rendered Ella Barak and translated Goddess Blessed. So hidden in the titles of men was a message meant for those with eyes to see. Turns out the Great Jewish Revolt wasn't a war between Rome and Jerusalem. It was a war between the two houses, Shammai and Hillel, the two versions of the divine. The house of Shammai, the legalistic, patriarchal, militant house, and the house of Hillel, the compassionate, philosophical house, guided by Neo-Pythagorean ideals and sacred union of opposites. It wasn't a political uprising, it was a spiritual civil war. One of the most sacred relics to arrive in medieval France was more than just an ornament, it was a message. It was called the Triumph of Joseph at the court of the Pharaoh, and it was shipped from the Byzantine treasury to Paris, along with the crown of thorns and the image of Edessa, all labeled as relics of Christ. In the 1279 inventory of Sainte-Chapelle, the cameo was listed not as imperial art, but as sacred testimony. by 1620 had been renamed the Great Cameo of France, its true meaning veiled, its connection to the story of Pharaoh's baker obscured. But the truth is still carved in stone. These are the faces of the family the church tried to erase. Cameo was called Triumph of Joseph at the court of the Pharaoh because Mark's Hebrew Midrash was written to fulfill Micah's daughter Jerusalem prophecy, Micah 4:8 prophecy. And the Midrash celebrated Pharaoh's baker, a goddess saved from crucifixion by her son Joseph, who convinced Pharaoh that the baker was not a goddess or a woman at all, but a god without a penis. And we'll look at Genesis 40:23 here in a moment and see what Hillel's version of that chapter and verse tell us. So the cameo qualifies as a relic of Christ, even though it produces images of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. But it's a relic of Christ because the couple who played the roles of Jesus and Mary Magdalene in Mark's Midrash are depicted on the cameo. So let's look at what Genesis chapter 40, verses 22 and 23 can tell us about the story of the baker. These Hebrew consonants, according to Shammai, would be rendered the Hebrew words that create the English translation of, but he hanged the chief baker, just as Joseph had interpreted to them. But Hillel's equally valid rendering and translation of the same string of consonants is translated into English, but the woman of light, baker, is Ella, Kesar's firstling, Ella, the mother of Joseph. Now, Kesar is the Sumerian first mother, and from her name Kesar comes the titles Caesar and later Kaiser. But Genesis 40:23 is where we get the real information that we need to understand the story of the baker. Shammai's rendering of these consonants is translated, "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." But the Nazarene choice of vowels and spaces and punctuation tells us that God is male, a man with a womb or compassion, mother of Joseph, but she is forgotten. Now, this strange story of Joseph's mother claiming to be a male but just missing a body part may have been the inspiration for the myth of Attis, the castrated god. This myth or practice might have been a way for women to perform duties and receive honors typically reserved for men. In 1838, Pope Gregory XVI removed the massive structure that had buried the Porta Maggiore, the Baker's Tomb, and the Neo-Pythagorean Temple. And at the same time, he restored and embellished parts of the Basilica Santa Maria Maggiore. So the excavation below and the decoration above was kind of a symbolic pairing that reflects the church's struggle with the sins of its past. And then just 1 year later, Pope Gregory issued a powerful decree in which he condemned the Atlantic slave trade and forbade Catholics from supporting it. The Pope, who uncovered the tomb of a former slave and spoke out against human bondage, may have known exactly what that tomb meant, that it was a symbol of equality, especially for the enslaved and for women. Pope Francis knew that when the gate and the tomb and the underground temple were uncovered in 1838, the tomb was empty. And unlike so-called pagan shrines that were destroyed during the 5th century purge, this tomb wasn't demolished. It was buried. It was buried with care. And that choice suggests something deeper. It suggests a reverence or even fear of desecrating the resting place of someone sacred and revered, someone the church knew had to be protected, someone they feared to dishonor. It was a woman. The Gospel of Thomas didn't make the final cut to get into the Christian Bible, but it has some really interesting information, and it's starting to be recognized now in scholarly circles. But the one that's of interest to us here is saying 114, where Simon Peter says, let Mary leave us, for women are not worthy of life. And Jesus replies, look, I will guide her to make her male, so that she too may become a living spirit resembling you males. Only a woman who makes herself male will be remembered throughout all time. Now, there are many myths of goddesses who posed as men. Pallas Athena wore armor and fought in wars. Dionysus was a Roman woman who asked Neptune to transform her into a man after she'd been raped. And Isis at times dressed as a man when she was searching for Osiris across hostile lands. So, disguised as males, women were less likely to be subjected to crimes committed against women. And as men, their work was more likely to be preserved, recognized, and considered valid for that matter. So, Jesus says, I will guide Mary to make her male. And what we discovered was that two of the males are Philo the Pythagorean of Alexandria, who developed a method for solving enigmas, and Pallas the freedman, who was with Claudius and considered the most powerful man in Rome during his reign. The baker's name and description are prominent on three sides of the tomb, and it's been assumed that the baker was the husband and Antistia was the name of his wife. But we're going to look at those names through the biblical Hebrew lens. The Marcus Marcii, the Mar, is from the Hebrew root mara, which is translated compassionate. If you just take the mr, it can become mor, translated mother light, and of course mr can become Mary, a name quite prominent in the New Testament. The word cei, the Hebrew equivalent is kai, which is translated life. And the Virgilii in Greek would be translated Virgin of Bella, and the Hebrew equivalent would be Betula Bella. So we're starting to see something a little bit different here than a baker and his wife. The name inscribed on the tomb, Eurysakis, has long assumed to have been the name of the Roman baker, but there's a hidden message in it when you look at it through the biblical Hebrew lens. The Hebrew consonants are R-Y-S-K-S. The Or is translated light. Aya was a goddess who was the goddess of dawn, radiance, and was the light bringer, kind of the equivalent of Venus. Ish is translated man, and Ki is the Hebrew word that can be translated in a number of ways, but including because, for that, when, surely, etc. And Isha is translated woman. So with these Hebrew words pulled from the name Eurysakis, the message is the light of compassion that comes from the first name, Mar. The light of compassion was brought to mankind through a woman. Now, the last three words, Pistoris Redemptoris Apparet, note the enlarged T in each of those words, symbolic of a crucifixion. The traditional English translation of those three words is baker, contractor, public servant, but linguists don't agree with that third assumption especially. But if you look at Pistoris Redemptoris Apparet in connection with Genesis 40, 22, and 23 makes a lot more sense. It tells us that when the baker was redeemed or saved from crucifixion by her son Joseph, she did so by appearing as a god without a penis. And the name of the most popular Roman deity, the one celebrated during the Ides of March, was Attis. So, what the translation actually is here in this inscription is the baker who was redeemed appeared as Attis Tia, Attis the goddess. The inscription reveals a subtle truth. Attis Tia is not a single name. It's two words carved in stone, Attis and Tia. Now, Thea is linguistically linked to Thea, as in Cleopatra, Thea Philopater, which is translated Cleopatra, beloved of the goddess. Thea is the feminine of Theo and is translated goddess. So to engrave the name of a god without a penis and then identify him as a goddess seems to be an act of subversion, a reference to the baker's transformation, and a reference to the triumph of Joseph at the court of the Pharaoh. Now, Attis was a deity whose cult celebrated castration and resurrection. And it was done each year during the Ides of March. Julius Caesar was assassinated on the first day of the Ides of March, and Tiberius Julius Caesar died on the second day of the Ides of March, 88 years apart. The hidden meaning of Attis comes from the Hebrew word etz, which is translated tree. The name Atistia wasn't carved into the baker's tomb itself. It appears on a separate funerary stele that was found nearby. The inscription reads, Attis Tia was my wife. She lived with me for many years. She was a most excellent woman, whose remains are laid to rest in the breadbasket. So the inscription is the explanation for the tomb and suggests that it held two bodies that were together in life through multiple metamorphoses and laid to rest together forever. Acts 7 opens with these words, Listen to me. The God of glory appeared to our ancestor Abraham when he was in Mesopotamia. Well, there's a problem here. Genesis 17, 1 through 5, we learned that Abram did not become Abraham until after he left Mesopotamia. So what's the message here? What's the author of Acts trying to say? Abraham and God of glory are enigmas. Abram is translated Father exalted. Abraham can be translated Father compassion, Father womb, but probably more important, the BRHM can become Bar HaM, which is translated Son of the Mother. This God of glory can be found at Micah 4:8. It's a prophecy of the return of daughter Jerusalem. In it are the words MGDLDR, which can become and should become M Gadal Adar, translated Mother Great Glory. Here is the God of glory that the author of Acts wanted to pass on to us. Not just telling a story, but preserving a suppressed truth. Theology buried beneath patriarchy, but never fully extinguished. A God with breasts, a goddess, a mother whose glory endures. Now, in the asp of Santa Maria Maggiore, this painting, the Great Mother crowned by her son, still reigns. She's also known as the Magdalene. Contrary to common assumptions and claims, the tomb does not glorify the worldly success of a freedman baker. And the baker was a woman. The God with breasts changed Ab-Ram, Father exalted, to Bar-Haim, son of the mother, and Abraham, father of compassion. She also changed his wife's name from Sarah, which is translated seed, to Sarah, which is translated woman of light. A word translated compassion is in Abraham's name, and it's on the tomb. So the message? Sarah's light was Kesar's light, and that light is compassion. Virgin mothers mated with Abraham's sons preserved it. It's passed through time, not through men, but through women. The Sumerian texts that tell of first father, mother from the heavens speaks about this bloodline. And it was incorporated into the Torah to preserve the knowledge of Kesar's gift, passed through generations by women, perhaps through the mitochondrial DNA. The tomb honors this lineage of compassion, this lineage of the light of the mother. The last Nasi was Gamaliel VI, who died around 425. The next year, the Nazarene way was condemned as a heresy and erased from memory, its sacred truths sealed away. And perhaps Francis knew that the last act of the last Nasi was one of love, to transport the remains of the couple known to history as Jesus, the Nazarene, and Mary the Magdalene to their final resting place at the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore, not as saints, not as relics, but two who carried the light together. Pope Francis knew about this cameo. It's carving once called the Triumph of Joseph at the court of the Pharaoh, the sacred image hidden in plain sight with its message buried beneath centuries of renaming and reinterpreting. To some, it depicts a royal celebration, an inauguration. To others, it reveals the family that wrote, produced, and directed the Genesis event when a son saves the life of his mother who had been condemned to be crucified. To those with eyes to see, the cameo is a visual gospel. It preserves the truth that compassion, loyalty, and wisdom are not the domain of kings, but the legacy of the sacred feminine. In the upper section of the cameo depicted are the members of the Julio-Claudian dynasty that were dead at the time of this inauguration scene. From the left, Marcus Agrippa. He has the shield. Next to him is Emperor Augustus holding the staff. Cleopatra carries the Eye of Ra to identify her. And then Julius Caesar is riding Pegasus. And that small figure between Augustus and Julius Caesar is the Lares of Augustus, which is identified with inaugurations. And so that dates this scene to January 24th, 41, when Claudius became emperor. It doesn't date the cameo, it dates the scene depicted on the cameo. On the right side of the screen is the middle row, which are the living members of the Julio-Claudian dynasty. Julia the Younger is holding her nephew Nero, a future emperor. Germanicus and his wife Agrippina the Elder stare at each other with loving eyes. Emperor Tiberius is caught mid-action passing a shield to Germanicus and Agrippina, and he holds the staff of the emperor. just out of reach of Claudius over on the right. And next to Claudius is his wife, Agrippina the Younger. On the throne is Julia the Elder, and below her, sitting dejected, head down, is Julia the Younger's husband, Lucius Marcus Paulus. So let's look at the sequence of key events that have taken place to this point in our story. In 380, Nicene Christianity became the official religion of the Roman Empire. Sometime between 420 and 423 to 425, Honorius buried the Baker's Tomb, the Porta Maggiore, and the Neo-Pythagorean Basilica. About the same time, Nasi Gamaliel VI died. And the painting of the Virgin and baby Jesus was painted. 431, at the Council of Ephesus, Pope Sixtus III consecrated Mary as God-bearer. And then from 432 until about 440, Pope Sixtus III commissioned the reconstruction and expansion of the Basilica Santa Maria Maggiore. But during the years Franciscus was Pope, he visited here often. Before he would embark on a journey or after he returned safely home, he would come here and always pray in front of this icon, this painting, the protectress of the Roman people. But why this painting? And why this particular chapel? Well, the evidence that we've collected, his actions, suggest that Pope Francis may have known that the remains of the Nazarenes, known to history as Jesus and Mary Magdalene, had been moved from the Baker's Tomb to the Basilica of Santa Maria Maggiore back between 420 and 440. And he knew that their resting place is beneath this image, beneath her gaze. It's not just an icon of the Virgin and Child. Perhaps he knew it was a memorial, a marker, a message waiting to be revealed. And perhaps he revealed it in his death. Pope Francis returned to the gospel of Jesus, service to others, compassion, love, forgiveness. And Pope Francis would have known that Genesis 1:1 had been incorrectly translated. The words translated in the beginning, God created, were incorrect because Elohim is not God, but gods, plural. The Elohim, God, goddess. Hillel and Gamaliel's accurate translation comes from the Hebrew words bar ish et ab or Elohim, Son of Man and Father Light, Goddess the Mother. That's the Nazarene Holy Trinity. And that explains why there are more than 80 references to Son of Man in the Christian Bible. It was a clue that the house of Hillel's Torah was the gospel of Jesus. And Pope Francis knew it. Pope Francis was asked about non-traditional gender roles. And his answer, who am I to judge, turned many of the faithful, both Catholic and Protestant, against him. But Pope Francis knew the traditional translation of Leviticus 18:22, man shall not lie with man, was incorrect because the Hebrew words are actually correctly translated. A zakar shall not lie with an isha. That's an abomination. Zakar was a descriptive term for the men who were not descended from Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and Joseph. They did not have the compassion that could properly produce offspring with the Betula-M, the Essene Nazarene women who are referred to as Isha. The prohibition had nothing to do with homosexuality. It was to prevent Zakar men from impregnating Nazarene women who carried the bloodline for Kisa. So lives lost and ruined over mistranslation, that's a travesty imposed by churches, many churches, Catholic, Protestant. And Pope Francis apparently understood that. And it appears Pope Francis tried to rectify it. Men whose names were translated Praise God, Goddess, and God, Goddess within, did their best to protect the memory and the gift of the Great Mother. They knew that blood of lambs or God-men cannot atone for sinful acts. They knew that compassion is the atonement. And we can honor them with gratitude. We can act toward others with their compassion. We can forgive without condition, as they did. It's 2,000 years later, and once again the spiral of destiny has turned. And now here we are. We are at its fulcrum. We will make the choice. Which shall it be this time? Jesus and Elohim's peace, love, light, or Paul and Yahweh's aggression, vengeance, and darkness?